Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. LibertyTalk.fm.
Welcome to Living the Solution with Dr. Elena George. Today we have an important show about our economic system and where we stand, where we're going, and quite frankly, what we need to understand to protect ourselves and to stay one step ahead. I was talking with my office manager today about how can we wean our patients from credit cards and debit cards and try to go back to checks and cash based, because I'm not so sure that I trust our system at this point. And today I wanted to have someone who can come and speak to this, because we're hearing a lot of things about digital currency and cryptocurrency and all the things that have come down the pipe, but I'm not sure we really understand it. So I wanted to have Mr. Paul Engel come on. He spent more than 20 years studying and teaching about both the Bible and the U.S. Constitution. He understands difficult concepts, and he can explain them in a way that people can understand. And he has a daily show on America Out Loud Network. You can reach him on Paul at constitutionalstudy.com. But today I want someone who can actually help us understand. So, Mr. Engel, I want to thank you so much for joining me. I know your time is quite precious.
Thank you, Elaine. It's a pleasure to be here. And, time is precious. It's the only thing we don't get more of. But you're right. This is an important topic for people to understand.
Every time I turn on the TV, economics seems to be the major thing that's worrying me. You were talking about the banks maybe being in trouble. We're talking about digital currency. We just had this fiasco with FTX and cryptocurrency. Let's start off with the basics. How does physical tender, carrying a dollar, how does that differ from having something that's digital?
Well, there are a couple ways. I mean, understand, if you take a dollar out of your pocket or out of your wallet, it's a Federal Reserve note. Back, I think it was in 1913 when they created the Federal Reserve. They're a quasi-private bank that issues what's effect a promissory note. In other words, originally that dollar bill was worth $1 in gold. You could go to a Federal Reserve bank, hand them your dollar bill, and you get $1 worth of gold back. When Nixon in the 70s took us off of the gold standard, something not legally allowed, but he did it anyway. Now that became what's known as a fiat currency. It's not based on anything except people's understanding of their trust in the federal government. So when you have a piece of cash, you've got a physical entity versus all different forms of digital currencies, which are just numbers in computers somewhere. So there's that physical aspect. But the other part of it is there's an anonymity to it. No one tracks, your bill has a serial number on it, but that number is not being tracked. In other words, when you go to the grocery store and you hand them a dollar bill, they're not writing down that serial number and reporting it somewhere so they can track what gets spent where. And the other major difference is I can't use a digital currency without a computer. I need something that's going to do the calculations. So that changes a lot of the dynamics of how we use this money. The biggest difference is when you go from a cash-based society to a digital currency, every transaction is recorded in a computer somewhere. Everything from buying a home to buying a stick of gum gets recorded in a ledger that somebody has access to. And that fundamentally is the difference between the two.
Well, the corollary question to that for me is, why would they want to know that? Why do they care if you're buying a piece of gum or a house? What do they stand to gain, and what power does that give them over the individual?
Well, it depends on who they is. So, for example, your credit card company, they want to know where you spend money because they can use that to help the people that you spend that money with get more of your money, because that's how the credit card companies make money. When you use a credit card, the vendor, the merchant you're doing business with, pays a fee to a company to process that transaction. So obviously, if I'm a credit card company and I can better understand how you spend your money, I know better how to advertise to you so that you spend more money using my card so that I get a greater income. That's the basics of advertising. What's interesting is when the government knows where you're spending all of your money. That, people often think of a question of privacy, but it's more than that. I use the example: you walk up to you go up to a gas station and you stick your card in the pump, and that little sign comes up that says authorizing. Today, that means your credit card company, the gas station's contacting your credit card company to authorize the transaction, and it's just between you and the company. And if the company doesn't do a good job, guess what? You're going to go to another credit card company because they're always competing for your business. Well, what happens when you go to different forms of digital currency? Uh, for the moment, let's set aside a cryptocurrency, which is slightly different. But if you talk about what's been talked about so much lately, which are the central bank digital currencies, now that authorization message means the government or some quasi government entity is authorizing your transaction. And a lot of people think, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. Why do I care if the government knows what I'm spending my money on? But I want you to think about the last couple of years, the last 3 years actually, where the government has said certain information is not allowed. It's misinformation. And what happens when they say, well, you've been a purveyor of misinformation. We don't want you. We don't think you should do that. So we're not going to authorize this transaction. We're going to, as they did up in Canada, we're going to lock all your bank accounts. We're going to freeze all of your bank accounts so you can't spend money on anything because you've angered the government. And before your audience thinks this is outrageous, it would never happen. Back under Obama, the Obama administration pressured banks to stop doing business with firearm and ammunition manufacturers because the Obama administration thought they were evil. What happens when we take today, where it's like most of you audience probably heard of ESG, environmental and social governments? What happens when the government says, you know what, we don't think you should be buying that much gasoline. We don't want you buying that gas stove. Rather than making them we're saying we're not going to sell them, we're not going to authorize payments for those anymore. So you're not going to be able to buy firearms. You're not going to be able to buy the vehicle you want. You can see the manipulation coming from government actors when they have the ability not simply to track what you spend your money on, but authorize each and every transaction.
That's a chilling thought,
It
that
should be.
somebody gets to control. And yeah, I agree. And something that is not illegal, but it's socially unacceptable in their mind, or from what the government wants to control. And that's the opposite of freedom. I mean, I don't understand how people could sit back. I don't care what, you know, political persuasion you are. Everybody is in the same ballpark with this one. Because when the government changes and you're no longer in favor, so to speak, it's only going to happen to you, right? I mean, this is not something that is in a vacuum. I can see it morphing, quite frankly, into beyond buying gas, beyond being able to shop for whatever utility you want. What about your medical history? If you don't have the right vaccinations, for example, is that going to stop you from actually being able to access society? So, on that note, let's take our first break. You're living in the solution. Welcome back to Living the Solution. We're speaking with Mr. Paul Engel, constitutional scholar. And before the break, I asked the question, I made a statement, but it really is a question as well. Can this be tied to other aspects of our freedom, specifically our healthcare and our ability to control our own body and our own person? Do you foresee that can jump to something like the healthcare system?
I don't think there's a question of it can. I think it already has. Think of it this way. We went through the recent COVID, and I use my wife as an example. My wife has MS, and so we deal with lots of different doctors. And I can't tell you the number of times we'll sit in a doctor's office and the way I describe it is they're not practicing medicine, they're practicing bureaucracy. It's, oh, you have these symptoms, you have these tests, therefore the answer is this, because that is what the government has said is okay. The doctors, becomes a functionary of government. And think about the number of people, the reports of people denied life-saving treatment because they refused to be a medical experiment. Think of the number of people who died alone because their family members weren't allowed to visit with them because they wouldn't take a life-saving treatment. By the way, an experimental treatment, I should say, that has not been licensed by the FDA. To require it, to coerce someone to take it, is a violation of the Nuremberg Code for medical ethics and a violation of U.S. law. But we've seen this for almost 2 years now. We have people losing their jobs because they've made a medical decision that is contrary to the current political dogma. And they've lost their jobs. In some cases, they've lost their homes. They've lost their liberty because the government decided that this is the only solution. And how many doctors have lost medical licenses because they said, you know what? We have doctors that have evidence that ivermectin, when used properly and with other treatment, can help treat the symptoms of COVID. Ivermectin, zinc, high dose vitamin C, hydroxychloroquine. There's even a CDC report saying that chloroquine has been proven to be effective in treating COVID-19, yet the president of the United States was lambasted for actually saying, not only did I try it, but it worked. How many doctors, how many patients have been denied possibly effective treatment because some government bureaucrat said, no, we don't want you to do this. We want you to do something else. We don't want to use the generic, low cost, long record of safety in human beings. We don't want you to use that. We want you to try a medical experiment that's extremely expensive, brand new. No one has any longitudinal data if it's safe. Nobody's bothered to test if it's effective, but that's what we want you to do. We already have that in medicine.
We do, and I think you're right. You make a statement that is absolutely true. We'll never know, frankly, how many people were affected by this one size fits all corporatized system that's been tied. I remember at the beginning, right? The phones were being able to track where you were in relationship to other people. So this has been going on for quite a while in the guise of safety and protection, but in actuality, it's at the expense of your freedom, whether that's your personal freedom, your freedom to speak your mind, and your ability to put whatever it is you want into your body. So I want to jump backward a bit. We talked about our kind of outsourcing our financial system to, my gosh, I'm drawing a blank on it. The
Federal Reserve?
Thank you so much. But from a constitutional standpoint, the power of the person to make money is Congress's responsibility, isn't it?
Yes. Article 1, Section 8 delegates to Congress the authority to coin or to make money and to regulate its value. And that's where things got a little interesting because Congress learned a century ago that it's much easier to pass a very generic framework law and let somebody else deal with the details. They get to take all the credit for passing the laws without taking any of the responsibility for the problems that come out of that. So rather than the federal mint making money, rather than the federal government itself printing this money, they handed it to the Federal Reserve. They created this private banking system to manage it. And yeah, that causes, in my mind, a lot of constitutional problems. Again, Congress has the authority. Not Congress has the authority to make laws to put into effect their powers. So there's a legal ease. Yes, okay, this was the law that they used to enact their powers. But what we forget is now Congress has given up control over it. Well, direct control. Because the Federal Reserve, we talk about being a private bank. It's really a quasi-private bank. It is, it is still managed, it's still influenced by the federal government, but its entire mandate is, in my mind, illegal. to control inflation, to regulate the money supply, in an attempt to sort of regulate the value of money. They don't directly regulate the value of money. So we end up with this very bureaucratic system that is trying to look at the entire population of the United States and figure out what it can do to manipulate people to do certain things to regulate the value of the dollar. And as frequently happens, it never works. The a system where you try to one size fits all regulate anything anywhere near the size of the United States, it has never worked in the past. It at least not for long periods of time. Yet we keep doing the same thing over and over again, which reminds me of a quote from Albert Einstein, who said, "Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome, is a definition of insanity." Well, I guess the American people, in some form, are insane because we keep doing this over and over again.
Well, is it us or is it Congress, right?
But we
from the
keep hiring Congress. Remember, in the 2022 election, 96% of the incumbents in Congress won re-election. We, the people, keep voting for the same people or the same type of people over and over and over again.
You can make an argument that the will of the people wasn't followed in any of these election cycles, because who knows, since it's another digital form of our system, which is the voting system, who knows? But taking a step back from that, do you think that if Congress was still minting its money, could we run at these ridiculous deficits that we're running at, leading to this weakening and just removing the value of the dollar? Would that actually be able to go on? Because there would have to be some accountability with what you spend and what you're able to mint, right?
Well, remember, the Federal Reserve, when they magically make money, when they simply swap some bits in a computer, they don't do it in a vacuum. Right? Congress says we want to borrow money. They tell the Treasury to issue bonds so that we can borrow money. All they're doing is selling those bonds to the Federal Reserve to actually do the physical process of making the money. So if Congress were coining the money, that would solve the debt problem. The logic to me of bringing the Federal Reserve under the direct control of Congress is if the members of Congress are abusing the Federal Reserve, the people at least have a chance to say, "Listen, that's not allowed. That's not wanted. We can vote for someone else. In certain situations, we can even impeach them." Which you can't do now at the federal. The Congress was foolish enough to create a bank that nobody can audit. It's totally insane. But the biggest problem is the American people. We hire people to represent us in Congress, but we don't. We never hold them accountable for their bad actions. We never hold them accountable, for borrowing $31.5 trillion. The American people have no idea how much money that is. If you were to stack bills, $100 bills, and you were to stack $1 trillion worth of $100 bills, it would be it would rise to an altitude twice that of the International Space Station. And we've borrowed 31 and a half stacks of those bills because Congress has no limit. The Constitution doesn't put a limit on how much Congress can borrow. The American people have continued to hire people that spend into oblivion. And we shouldn't be surprised if someone gave you a credit card and every time you hit the limit, they just added numbers they just increase your borrowing limit. You'd spend money like crazy too because there's no consequence. You never have to pay it off. You never as long as you make the interest payments, nobody cares. That's what we've done with Congress, and we shouldn't be surprised they're acting the way they are. We've trained them that we don't want to pay the bills for all the goodies they give us. Just borrow the money and let our children pay for it.
So I know we're going to take a break in about 3 minutes, but I want to just ask a question about this whole COVID money campaign that we've had over the past 2 years. So obviously the economy shut down, people got money to help them survive, but it kind of kept going a little bit longer. Is it sustainable? Did it push us over the edge? I mean, can we even come back from a $31 trillion deficit? Even if we were to tax everybody more, would it ever be, would we ever be sustainable?
Well, the problem isn't the taxing. The problem is the spending. So I've done a little research on this. There's a website called usaspending.gov. And if you look at it, there's about $11.5 trillion in spending authorization at all the cabinet level departments throughout the executive branch. 11 point. Now, I went through them and I said, the Constitution says, the 10th Amendment says, if a power is not delegated to the United States, they can't do it. It belongs to the states or the people. So I looked through that and I said, well, how many of these departments could possibly be doing something that is authorized by the Constitution? And I came out with about $4.8 trillion worth of spending that is absolutely or most likely authorized by the Constitution, which is interesting because that's pretty much what the federal government took in taxes in 2021. Sorry. No, sorry, it was 2022. But it left $6.5 trillion in spending that is not authorized by the Constitution. There's our problem. It's not that we collect too much in taxes. It's that Congress spends money they're not authorized to spend, and we, the American people, are more than happy with it because, well, we get our checks and our goodies and our programs, and we seem quite fine with it.
Well, I know we're going to take a break in a minute, but I want to start the conversation about going back a little bit on these bonds. Are we putting ourselves at risk? Because yes, the government may buy them, but don't foreign countries like China also buy these bonds? And how does that put us, or does it put us into danger? So I want you to think about that when we come back and answer. We'll take our second break. You're living in the solution. Welcome back to Living the Solution. We're speaking with Mr. Engel. And before the break, I wanted to ask a question, or did ask a question about foreign governments buying our bonds, right? What's the upshot of that? It doesn't seem all that safe to me. If you're beholden to a foreign entity that doesn't like you, is that a good thing? I mean, what's the worst thing that can happen if that has been the case?
Well, yeah, what do they say? The borrower is subject to the lender, and it's less the fact that these foreign countries currently hold these bonds. It's the fact that because a bond matures, there's a point when the federal government has to pay off the bond along with interest. It's the continuing to purchase them that causes the problem. It's in other words, it's not that China currently holds something on the order of $1 trillion worth of American debt. It's when that debt comes due and we pay off that debt, they turn around and say, "Yeah, we're not borrowing anymore." That's where they can manipulate things. Because if you're afraid that, how many movies themes, how many TV stories revolve around, well, we don't want to anger the elderly person because they'll cut us out of our will. No, we don't want to get cut out of the will. It's in some ways the same way. If we don't want to anger our piggy bank, because if they stop loaning us money, this house of cards falls apart. And it's one of the reasons why our founding fathers, when they created the office of president, they said we want that person to be a natural born citizen. We want them to be beholden to the United States, not to a foreign country. Congress has, in effect, made us, or to a certain extent, made us subject to a foreign country. Just look at what we went through with China. But I'm old enough to remember when we had an economic upheaval because a bunch of countries in the Middle East decided they were going to stop selling us so much oil. When we become dependent on others, he who pays the piper calls the tune. That's just a part of the human condition. It's one of the reasons why we want to control certain core aspects of our society and our economy. And the part of the problem is the American people, in my mind, have never quite understood the cost because it's not obvious. You go to a store and you buy a T-shirt or a pair of sneakers or anything, and we never think, okay, well, I'm going to buy this one because it's cheaper, not realizing, yeah, but that product was made by slave labor in China. There's a cost to that, but we don't see the cost and we don't think about it. It's the same reason why Congress can roll up trillions and trillions of dollars in debt. The American people don't see the cost, so we don't feel the pain right away. When we do feel the pain, it's kind of too late to deal anything. You're now dealing with an extremely sick patient, and the cure is going to be quite long and painful. Unfortunately, people don't want to take the medicine.
I think they're going to be forced to at some point. So, is the central bank digital currency some sort of trap door around this? This is not a fixable problem from what you just described. Is the central bank digital currency a way around it? I mean, you just create your own money out of thin air, and you can do whatever you want. You just change people over to the system.
Well, the Federal Reserve already does that. What the CBDCs do is allow the government not simply to issue money, but to regulate its use. Right? Congress can coin money; they can regulate the value of the money, but a CBDC allows them to regulate its use, either directly or indirectly. And that's the dystopian future we're looking at. But believe it or not, there is still hope. See, in the Constitution, states can still use silver and gold as currency, which means the federal government can say, yes, you must use a CBDC to pay, say, your federal taxes, but they can't
Hmm.
force you to use it within your state to pay your state or with your neighbors or your stores or your gas stations. There are several states that are looking at setting up uh, uh, precious metal depositories, gold and silver depositories, with the view of potentially treating them more like banks, so that the people have a choice other than a federal government system. It was done originally because the Federal Reserve has so debased the currency, thanks to Congress's borrowing and spending. It's also, by the way, why cryptocurrencies were brought around. They were trying to find ways to insulate ourselves from these actions. But probably the best is not at the federal level; it's at the state level, and have the state say, "Yeah, okay, we're going to issue, gold and silver certificates, and you can pay your bills with them, and you can pay, and it'll be a stable currency. And if Washington D.C. just goes off the deep end, we can still have a method of transaction that is protected from them.
How can you find out if your state is advanced like this?
Probably the best place is to search for legislation in your state. I know Texas has one. Where I live here in Tennessee, there's legislation in place to set one up. I think there are two or three others, but I would ask your representative, hey, are there plans to set up a gold and silver depository? If not, why not? Because right now, I laugh. Um, the We talk about the price of things. We talk about this inflation. We always think of the price of things going up when what's really happening is the value of the dollar is going down. And it's a time to have a discussion with your representative saying we should be protecting ourselves from the bad actions of the federal government. That's your role. That's part of your role in this union. Why aren't we doing something about it?
It's a preventive strike before you end up with no choices, right? Um, bef- oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just to say, yeah, in a way, yes. The body won't go where the mind hasn't been. Prepare for hope for the best, prepare for the worst. We put fire extinguishers in our homes, in not because we expect a fire, but just in case. We buy health insurance, life insurance, auto insurance, not because we expect to need it, but just in case. This is just another form of insurance.
I think that's a really great way to see it. And in terms of this plan, it's almost like a planned economy where they get to run the show and decide the winners and losers, and you can't deviate from these bounds that they're putting you on. How is that really sustainable? Part of what makes any economy run is the power of the people and the power of choice and having a product that's good and having people want that product. So if you don't have any kind of pressure to be good, to be customer oriented, what kind of society? I understand totalitarian. I get that. I know that's coming or what they'd like. But is it even sustainable? Honestly, this is just going to be the race to the bottom.
Well, history says it's not sustainable because the only central planned economy that has in any way, shape, or form survived is China. And they did so by relaxing their control over the economy. Soviet Union, Venezuela, the Eastern blocs, all of these planned economies fail for one simple reason. Like you said, if there's no possibility of success, there's no incentive to try harder. If there's no incentive to try harder, you do the minimal amount to survive. Or as I heard Reagan once say, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us, and that's what happens. And the sad part is, I think it was Santianos that first said, "He who does not learn from history is doomed to repeat it." We haven't learned from our history. We are dooming the American people. We are dooming our children to repeat some of the worst aspects of the 20th century because we refuse to learn from the history of the 20th century. I remember, I think it was Boris Yeltsin on a trip to New York City, was absolutely dumbfounded, shocked to walk into a grocery store in New York City because the shelves were full and you had choices, you had brands. It was inconceivable to someone who had just come out of the Soviet era to see a grocery store where you could buy different, 4 different types of bread and, 17 different types of deodorant and 27 versions of toothpaste. It was beyond his comprehension.
It's interesting. They're trying to, it seems to me, if you think about this in that, with that filter, they're trying to get us to actually withdraw our, we're going to ask for less because it's racist or because it's against the earth or it's global warming. So they're asking us to literally volunteer to deny ourselves, to deny our humanity, to deny what makes us human, which is to strive. They want us to do it to ourselves using all of these overlays. Like being wanting to work hard is now racist. It's just idiotic. Some wanting to work out and be healthy is racist. I mean, it's just amazing what they're coming up with. Do you think that people are buying this?
Sadly, evidence says a lot of them are. And that's partially because they've gotten really good at suppressing countervailing ideas. As a doctor, the scientific method, right? You hypothesize, you have a theory, you create a hypothesis, you test a hypothesis, you modify the hypothesis based on the results of the test. And they've said, no, we have a hypothesis, we have a theory, and any challenge to that is anti-science. So whether it's economics, whether it's global warming, whether it's racism, whether it's sexuality, we've become so dependent on other people to decide for us. One of the things I do, which I find quite unique, is I get news sources from dozens of different sources, left, right, and center. I go through about 600 headlines a night looking for content for my radio program. And how often I see people simply read a headline and assume that's the details of the story and never check the facts. I mean, how often have we been told that the COVID, the mRNA treatments, which are not legally vaccines, that they were safe and effective? It became a mantra: safe and effective, safe and effective. What are we finding? They're not safe. There's a greater than normal chance of severe adverse reactions. And just simple observation says they're not effective. How many times have Joe Biden been boosted and gotten COVID? How many times has Kamala Harris been boosted and gotten COVID? But yet we've allowed them to suppress this idea because we became dependent on others to tell us what we need to know. We let them curate what we needed to know. We gave up the liberty of finding out for ourselves and thinking for ourselves. We became lazy and narcissistic. And like anyone else, we think we're right and we want to impose our will on others. It actually takes a conscious act to decide, I think, I vehemently disagree with you, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Takes conscious activity. We don't like that, and we've fallen into this pattern partially because our education system has become so destroyed, partially because we've allowed the family to crumble, and partially because when people came up with the dumbest ideas, we listened to them. I love to quote Thomas Sowell, who once said, Hillary Clinton said it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village idiot to believe that.
On that note, let's take our last break. You're living in the solution. Welcome back to Living Solution. We're speaking with Mr. Paul Engel. And Mr. Engel, how can people listen to your show?
Well, I have a radio program. You can find it on AmericaOutloud.com. It's 5 days a week, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, where I focus on the world around us from a constitutional point of view. It's what's the judges doing, what are Congress is doing, what are states doing, and I'm trying to educate people about the Constitution. I follow a quote from our first Supreme Court Chief Justice, who said, "Every member of the state ought diligently to read and study the Constitution of his country and teach the rising generation to be free. But by knowing their rights, they'll sooner perceive when they're violated and be the better prepared to defend and assert them." So that's where you can feel. And by the way, if you can't listen at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, the programs go to podcast generally a couple days after they're heard on the radio. So you can always listen to it through the apps for on Apple, Android, or Alexa, or through your favorite podcast app. Plus, I have a website called called constitutionstudy.com. And there I do long form articles and videos, and I answer questions. And that's more of the interaction with the Constitution Study. You can also find me on most social media. I'm not on Facebook and I'm not on LinkedIn because both of them kicked me off and won't let me back on. So I figure if they don't want me, I don't want them. But I'm on Twitter, YouTube, Rumble, Getter, Gab, and as far and wide as I can get myself, that's where people can find. Just search for Constitution Study, and you can generally find me.
People definitely need to do that because you're a wealth of knowledge and you really do have a knack for being able to make it user friendly. It's just easy to digest, and I think knowledge is power. It doesn't matter. I agree with you before the break. You shouldn't have anybody tell you what to do. Do your own research. This was something that we learned in school: critical thinking and citing your source and being able to have an opinion but back it up, and not just because it feels good. Now, before the break, we were talking about a lot of things, including our banking system. I wanted to segue to cryptocurrencies because I think when I first learned about things like Bitcoin, it seemed like a disruptor, like it was outside the box and it could be outside of this centralized system. Between all these things happening with FTX, you wonder, I know I may be a little bit cynical, but was it a way to denigrate it and to make it to put people on alert so they would run to the central banking digital currency?
It's possible. I follow the Occam's razor. If you hear hoofbeats, think horse, not zebra. See, FTX had nothing to. The FTX was a crypto exchange. The problems at FTX had nothing to do with crypto. It was a Ponzi scheme, pure and simple. It was no different than Bernie Madoff. He just used cryptocurrency as his tool. Yes, cryptocurrencies were designed. People were tired of having central banks manipulating the value of currency. They wanted another option. And this actually goes back, if memory serves, back to the 1960s of people trying to find ways to have a digital currency that they could wrest control from government. The problem with cryptocurrencies, in my mind, and I'm not saying they're interesting for me. The problem is they're often misunderstood. It's called cryptocurrency because it uses cryptographic algorithms to create the bitcoins and the tokens, and it uses cryptographic technology to transfer them between entities. But what you're dealing with is an absolutely a fiat currency, meaning there is nothing behind it. There's no valuable item that this money represents. I said a dollar used to be based on the gold standard it was worth $1 worth of gold. That doesn't exist anymore in cash, and that never existed in cryptocurrency. The other thing a lot of people say is things like Bitcoin. There will only ever be so many Bitcoins. Well, as I spent 30 years in IT, I know better. The only reason there is a limit on the number of Bitcoins is a line of code in a computer program. So all it takes is a change in that line of code. And guess what? Now there's more Bitcoin, which of course goes back into the whole inflation currency nonsense. In fact, it's already happened once. The original Bitcoin split into two different currencies, Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash. So suddenly there were twice as many Bitcoins. They just had slightly different names to them. There are technical issues with cryptocurrency from the standpoint of the time it takes to complete a transaction based on the blockchain technology. Those can be resolved, and if we can come up with a cryptocurrency that there's something to trust, that people can truly trust in it, that'll help stabilize its value and make it more readily available for people to use. But understand, at that point, you're basically talking about a digital barter system. Probably a better way to describe cryptocurrencies is a digital barter system. And hopefully that'll explain it to people in your audience.
So if it's digital and it depends on the internet to work, what happens if you lose the ability to access the internet? Do you lose your funds?
Yeah, in fact, that's one of the things that people talk about. If there's an EMP, if the internet goes down, no more Bitcoin. So if you're somewhere, just imagine somewhere you grab your phone to pay for your gas with Bitcoin, and there's no internet service. You can't pay for anything. Now imagine what happens if something were to cripple not just a local area network, but a wide area network, if large segments. I mean, you may remember a point where Netflix was down through like a large percentage of the U.S., like eastern of every part east of the Mississippi, because of a data center problem. Well, imagine it's not watching a movie. Imagine it's again paying for food, paying for gasoline, um, paying for the things you need to live. That would be a very dangerous thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, a friend of mine went to a store and they were no longer accepting payment by debit or credit card or Apple Pay or something, and they wanted cash, and people had to leave because they didn't have cash. And imagine if that's as you said, a supermarket or a gas station. You're stuck. You're not driving to work without that type of fluidity. So, we have 3 minutes left, but I want to talk about solutions on this. How can people get themselves to be a little bit more resilient? Should they keep money? Should they start to gather gold and silver as a hedge on this? I don't think we can just depend on the bank anymore from what we're talking about. You have to think outside the box.
Yeah, you do. And everybody's going to be different. Everyone's going to have a different tolerance for risk and a different tolerance for pain. What I recommend is when whatever decision you start looking at, um, ask yourself to look at the unseen costs. So, for example, you talk about precious metals. Yes, okay, having gold and silver not a bad idea, but consider this: you don't want a gold or silver certificate because that's just a piece of paper that someone's holding gold for you. If you don't trust them, then how do you get your gold? Also, consider going to the grocery store to buy a quart of milk, and all you've got is an ounce of gold worth several $100s. It's going to be a bear to make change. So, yes, I would tend to lean towards physical precious metals in small denominations that are more functional, more useful. But there's a cost to that, right? Where are you going to keep it? How are you going to keep it safe? What happens if somebody comes in and simply robs you and steals? Imagine your entire life savings being turned into precious metals, and then somebody breaks in and steals it. Now you're stuck. So there's got to be a balancing act of risk versus reward that's going to be different for everybody. Most of all, I would take the example of sit down and think, if this happens, what would I do? not just cash. Do I have enough food on hand? If there's a disruption, is there food? Do I have some source of water and power? And what if the power goes out for an extended period of time? Have I made preparations for that? And people, by the way, who live in large cities, you're going to have a very, very difficult time. I think Manhattan has about 2 days worth of food on the island. So imagine if, something happened and you couldn't get food in or out, people would get real hungry real fast. Think about the worst case scenario, prepare for it, but hope for the best. Just be willing to prepare for what really may go bad.
I think if you have that little kernel, it just puts you in a better position not to panic, because that's really, I think, the worst thing you can possibly do is to freeze and panic and be stuck without any choices at all. I know time goes so quickly, but I want to make sure that people know how to listen to your podcast and your show.
Go to AmericaOutloud.com. You'll find all the links on the homepage. Just look for the show, the Constitution Study, or look for me, my name, Paul Engel. You can find it there. You can also find everything at the website, constitutionstudy.com. You can also find my books and other products at that website as well.
Mr. Engel, it was an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I look forward to having you back. I think we gave a nice synopsis, but I think there's a lot more to explore. It's such a huge topic, but you made it really fun and just a wealth of information.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for living in the solution.
Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Liberty Talk FM.